the mic.
That's right. Just gonna try to take it out. All right. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Vital Communities, who's our host, and I'll introduce my colleague Michelle, who'll talk a little bit about New Hampshire Listens, and then we'll review the agenda and dive in. So as I understand this story, Sean and Tracy, excellent people that they are, said we should really engage in a dialogue that brings Hartford and Lebanon together and find out what it is we're thinking about housing. And so I think that's a great plan. Vital Communities is really interested in supporting regional solutions, and we have worked on the housing issues, as I think many of you know, for a number of years. So this is exactly the kind of thing that Vital Communities loves, is how do we get people from other sides of the river, different towns, and embracing the issues that we need to be thinking about, and hopefully starting a dialogue that would lead to some practical solutions that work. And while we're talking about housing, honestly, that is what Vital Communities is doing really every day, whether it's energy policy, leadership development, transportation policy. It really is, it's not a public interest group in the sense of we have solutions and we're coming to you to advocate for them, but we're really interested in what are the issues that you care about and how can we help you take those actions. So that's what Vital Communities is doing, and I think we're hosting this. So,
all right.
And Michelle.
Great. Michelle Holt Shannon, I'm the director of New Hampshire Listens. We are in the Carsey School of Public Policy at UNH. We work all over the state. We really help people solve problems in their community, get more people engaged, and find solutions to complex issues. And I'm honored to be with you all tonight, and look forward to the conversation.
The agenda is really fairly simple. I mean, housing is not a very big or complex problem. We should be able to work it out by 9 o'clock, I would think.
Yeah, we're on it. Yeah.
Right, and that too, world peas. But really our model is this. We would like to have opening statements, which will be concise, and I'll frame that in a minute. And then we're gonna do 2 fishbowl exercises, and that basically we're gonna be asking people to come sit in the center, and it's a little bit easier to have a more of an exchange of ideas when there are fewer than 15 or 16 people sitting around. So we'll ask some small groups to come together. Michelle will introduce those. We'll do 2 of those rounds. There'll be a bathroom break between them. And then at the end, we're gonna come back out and basically ask everybody, so what have we heard here? And what are some possible next steps that we can take? So it really is intended to be an opening of a conversation rather than a closing of one.
Yeah. I mean, we've structured it a little differently than maybe the meetings that you're normally a part of, so that we can get a mix of voices, to have smaller groups sort of dig into certain parts of the conversation, come back to the larger group. There's no secret code behind how we structured it. It's really just to see if we can get creative in the conversation. And just to invite you all, just bring your authentic self, ask each other curious questions, and say what you care about and say why. So that's what we're hoping can happen as much as possible in this conversation.
Yeah. So we would like to simply go around with sort of opening statements, and I'm going to ask you to engage in that same spectacular conciseness that you did earlier, looking for really about 2 sentences. And the question is, what is keeping you up at night about housing in your town, in your city? Do you mind starting?
I think the thing that keeps me up at night is how to simultaneously achieve affordability in new construction and renovation while moving construction very quickly towards net zero carbon emissions. And that's a real challenge in terms of our sustainability, both economically, in terms of a diversity of housing that people can afford, and our, energy and climate sustainability.
I guess I would say, for me, it's been kind of a social issue or a social justice issue. That's what keeps me up. Having been, as I was speaking before, when I moved from beyond Enfield Center into town, it was because I wanted to be closer to Hanover High School where I was teaching. But I had gone from a home that, with land, and it was very depressing to come into Hanover and try and find something that I could afford. And I actually cried when I moved into a condo. It was, half as big and more expensive than my mortgage back in Enfield. And within a year or two, my daughter came home on the bus and she was crying and she said, "Mama," she said, "one girl on the bus said this is a place where people who can't afford real homes live." And so I understand that, I do hear people talking about some of the issues about wealthier communities, poorer communities, et cetera. And I don't know how we can achieve a balance, but I do know we need to work at it. We can't just say it's unsolvable.
I think one of the things that makes Lebanon so special, and I would imagine maybe you have similar feelings about Hartford, but I like to say that Lebanon is a city that feels like a small town. And I think one of the things that really concerns me about housing is how do we increase the units? How do we do that in a sustainable way for all different kinds of income levels while maintaining the quality of life and the characteristics that people really love about our community? And so how do we, I think sustainability and how do we preserve that character is really important to me as we are dealing with this. That does keep me up at night. And I think the other piece is, like Mary said, the social justice piece. Right now, people are having to move farther and farther away. People are having to live in housing situations that are not the best for their family, that are not conducive to raising kids, and it's becoming harder and harder. And I think we have, and on top of that, so at the individual level, there's that, but then we also are hearing from businesses that they're not able to recruit and retain people. People are having to retract their job acceptances because they can't find housing. And so I see this right now, that the lack of housing is causing headwinds on our ability to maintain our economic vitality, and I'm concerned about our future. So that's really what keeps me up.
I sound like I'm echoing everyone else, but I think the issues that we have in the Upper Valley are that we don't have enough affordable housing even for individuals that work here, as Karen just said. And that really puts a damper on us growing our communities in the direction that we want to grow them. The other thing I think we need to be sensitive to is that we each have our own towns, but we are the Upper Valley. So just because the borderline is there, we need to be creative about how we address issues. And let's face it, this is a crisis. So I think we need to look at the rules and perhaps short-term bend them a little bit so that we can get some units, whether they're houses that people can buy or places that people can rent, so that we can address this issue, because the issue is not going away. And I feel on some levels, individuals have to move because the rents go up too much or they can't find somewhere to be, and they sort of get chased from town to town. They end up going further and further away, and then we have in the winter when the roads are bad, et cetera, people just can't get to work, and that affects all of us. So I think we need to look at the bigger picture. I think we need to be creative, and I don't like at all when individuals point the finger at individual towns for them not stepping up and doing things. As I said, we're the Upper Valley, and we need to work together to find a solution. Some towns have infrastructure that allows that, and some towns don't. So we need to all come to the table and figure out what we need from those towns that don't have the infrastructure. Is it financial support? Is it something different? But I think there's solutions out there. I think we just have to really think outside the box, but stay in the Upper Valley.
Hello. When I think about housing, It's obviously a pretty complex issue. And I'm always struck, so I've lived in Vermont for about 15 years, and when I tell people White River Junction for just the past year, and I'm always struck in telling people that I live in White River at the response that you get. People always say, oh, White River's changed so much in the last 15 years, 20 years. And I think when you look at housing, you think about how complex of a problem this is, because we're talking about, there's so many dimensions to it, let's say, that I think it's important to say, how do we look at this from the arc of 10 years, 20 years, a generational scale, so that what we do now is that we're figuratively planting trees in the shade of which we'll never sit, so that we in governance and with the responsibility and the ability now can make decisions that are going to provide relief, certainly today, but more importantly, make sure that we lay good foundation and infrastructure, whether that is cultural or whether that is actually pipes and wires in the ground, so that 10 years from now and 20 years from now, the citizens who live in this area can look back and say, be grateful for that, and say that we really sort of looked at that with a meaningful, grander perspective. So I think there's a balancing that is really important for me, where the impulse is certainly we see the issue, which is in front of us and extremely painful, and our impulse is to do anything we can to solve that, which I think is a very real and sincere impulse that I believe we all share. But what can we do on a broader systemic level, even if that sometimes means making hard choices now, tough decisions now? And I think to close this, I'll just give a parable, which is last year, I ended up, I've done a lot of hitchhiking, so I always give hitchhikers rides if I'm driving alone. It makes no difference to me. And through that, you end up meeting a lot of people who are unhoused or homeless, and I knew that during November, there were absolutely no shelter beds available, even through 211 and so forth. So just through a series of sort of circumstances, I ended up actually inviting a homeless couple to stay with me overnight last November, and it kind of turned into a very uncomfortable situation. And then the second night, I ended up getting them just a motel room and having to say, you're on your own. And I didn't know what to do. And it was a really painful moral quandary, because I knew, this is November, it was freezing cold. And I knew that I was sort of leaving them out to the harsh realities that were out there, but I also didn't know what else I could do personally. So I think when I think about these trade-offs that we make, it is sort of the immediate solution could be just to let them into our homes and feed them and cohabitate with us. But what can we do on a systemic level that will actually create positive change at the root?
I'm going to interrupt just for a quick second. I'm very grateful. And I'm also, mostly we will not be in a database conversation, but I'm adding more than 2 sentences up as each of you speak. And so I'm perfect, and let's maybe just a little shorter, just so we can keep moving. No, thank you, Rocket.
I had many semicolons.
Okay.
Brief, Rocket, brief.
Perfect. Thank you. Erling, go ahead.
I think what we have heard, and I'm sure all of us have seen, that to me, the really big challenge here is how do we relate to our fellow communities, and how do we invite them, as what's happening here tonight, to become part of the solution, because this solution no community can solve, and no community should try to do that. We need to do what is good for the community, so the community moves forward with a vision of its own identity and feels good about opening up more spaces. But I think that the greater challenge is how do we invite other communities to do the same? And that has been a problem I've been around a long, long time, and it hasn't changed very much. So as we look to our north, we sometimes wonder, can't we build houses in the north as well as the middle of the country? And I think that that is a challenge which, if we could find solutions through that, the entire region will be better. And it's a regional problem, we need regional solutions, and somehow we need to step out of the circle which we're in, because we haven't been able to expand that very much. But we need to find ways to expand our commitment to making housing available for everybody. I think that, to me, it's a really big one. I ended up adopting a boy who was in need of a space and lived with us for quite a while, and I was foster child. I was a foster parent for kids. There are kids in our community that need support, and I beg all of you to go ahead and invite them in and support the child as they are growing up. We need them and they need us.
Thanks. I think one of my main concerns is just the inability for certain people to be able to live in the community in which they work. I think that has a lot of negative effects, both on the person who can't live where they work and on the community, which loses, access to people who would make a valuable contribution to that community.
So only 7 of our 9 counselors are here tonight, and one of the counselors asked me to read a statement from him. It's much longer than 2 sentences, so I've effectively condensed it to 2. And this is from Councilor Devin Wilkie. I had hoped to engage in thoughtful discourse about the need to meet the needs of not only the families we see frequently, but also the underserved members of our community, from workers in retail and food service to young single adults who otherwise leave for communities with a social cohesion that supports them. I had hoped to join in the energy and dedication that this focused joint meeting inspires. From my standpoint, in the spirit of brevity, I will say one of the probably 6 or 7 things that keeps me up at night is that it's not just about adding units, it's about adding the right mix of housing units so that we can serve the broadest portion of the community, and people are actually able to come here and stay here and move from an apartment to a starter home to whatever, and right now that's a great big hole.
Yeah, so I would say for me, it's as a counselor, it's balancing the need for affordable housing against sustainable growth, because they are in many ways at odds. As we grow, if we grow housing stock slower to ensure our communities grow at a measured pace, it's going to drive the price up. If the price goes up, we can't be affordable. So really what we can do to do that and ensure that we have a housing market and a housing availability that meets really everyone's needs, because we can't just keep leaving it to market forces. I mean, we're seeing the results right now where what we're getting is, either, decent sized new construction that a lot of people can't afford, or condos. And there's really nothing in between. And the missing middle is, I think, a really key component to what we're trying to address.
Thanks. I definitely echo all these sentiments as well. I think the thing that keeps me up at night is mostly the desire to meet people's basic needs, and there's no way for there to be housing security if there's not food security, transportation security, living wage security. I mean, so obviously, what gets me out of bed in the morning are discussions like this and ideas around ways of supporting people's basic needs being met, including a lot of these elements around housing. That I will stop there, but I could go on.
Yeah, I had a great story, but I'll keep it short, or at least an interesting story. Ultimately, we're all here to hear all ideas, search and listen for the answers, and then commit to what those are. I'll just say that.
I think similarly to what some others have shared, I'm thinking a lot about the disparities and the inequities that come to the forefront when we're talking about housing, that keeps me up at night. So for instance, at the state level of Vermont, we know that, for instance, Black home ownership rates are at only 21% compared to white home ownership rates, which are at 72%. And so we can't talk about housing if we're not talking about racial justice, economic justice. Something else that keeps me up at night is the fact that we have, we're approaching winter, we have unhoused folks in our community who are camping right now. And we know that unhoused folks often have chronic disabilities and different issues that they're dealing with. So we can't talk about housing justice if we don't talk about disability justice and healthcare justice. So that's what keeps me up at night, and I'm delighted to be in conversation and in partnership as we're really thinking about this in community and in partnership in the region.
So can you all hear me with the mask on? I apologize about that, but got a immunocompromised person at home, and I want to be really careful. This statement is actually, I'm borrowing this, but I think it's really important point to make. When we look at issues like homelessness and other, not homelessness, but housing issues and many of the other varied problems with society, I think some of the things that we should try to learn is that, and I'm going to quote now, that oil is worthless in a society without consumption, that healthcare has to be a public because health is public, and that 50% of jobs can be done from home, while the other 50% deserve more than they're being paid. But the most important statement here is that we have to remember that we live in a society. We don't live in an economy. And much of our housing discussions are always based on the economic discussions and not about the fact that we have a society.
Thank you. While I don't disagree with anything that's been said here, I'm going to be a little bit selfish on behalf of Hartford and say that we have a lot of positions in the town of Hartford for vacancies that we're looking for employees in the town of Hartford. We just went through something with the fire department where we had firefighters that were challenged for looking for housing. And we need to have affordable housing so we can grow our own town's infrastructure through our employees within the town. And I'm sure Lebanon has the same issue, is that we have very good paying jobs in the town of Hartford. But if you can't find housing, no matter what you find for a job, it's fruitless. Like I say, maybe a little bit selfish and a plug for us to do that, but thank you.
Great. Thank you all. That was nice to hear all of your voices to kick off this conversation. In a second, Rob and I are going to move some chairs around here, and we're going to invite some of you who have said that you are willing to jump into a fishbowl. The fishbowl is essentially that. We'll be swimming around in our own conversation right here. We'll all be listening in and letting just a few voices bat around the question. Then we'll go back out to you all, get a few comments, then we'll do a second fishbowl where we get to dig in a little bit on the second question. And so be careful as you move around on the stage. And Rob, do you have any other setup that you want to give in terms of?
I don't think so.
Rob, I don't know if I put my name in, but I'm happy to.
Water, I can get some. Like a waiter?
So, our first question, how are we miking this card? Bring the mic. Okay. Everybody bring your mic.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. All right. So our first question and our first group is going to be, let's see here. Counselor George, Counselor Doug, Assistant Mayor Clifton, Counselor Kim, and Counselor Abby. And the question that we are going to be discussing is, what do young people and young families want, and how can we provide for them? How about older adults, downsizing families, that sort of mix of housing, starting with a focus on young people and young families. Thank you.
I guess.
Also try not to fall off the stage.
Exactly.
We all have goals.
Thank you.
Just don't feel comfortable.
Young people, young families, downsizing families, older adults aging in place. That's actually a lot all at once. Let's just start with young families and get some of your initial thoughts there.
So I'd be willing to start on that. So one of the things that I think that's really important when we talk about housing for young families is a couple of things that we want to do. I think we want to bring young people here because both Vermont and New Hampshire are aging, and it's really important for the vitality of both the region to get young people here. So how do we do that? Well, we look at what it is that they want. And they're, to my mind, well, by the way, I'm not a young person, but to my mind, they're looking for transportation, not necessarily cars, that they're looking for things to do in terms of a social life or recreation and so on. And then lastly, they're not necessarily tying into the whole thing of one job, one life, or one house and one life. They're looking for the flexibility to move around in their job, maybe move around in their living circumstances. And if we don't try to answer those questions for them, then we won't be able to attract young people to come to the region, which I think is really important.
So I guess I'll speak maybe as the resident young family person, but like one of the reasons we moved to Lebanon was the community, and just being in a community and being able to see our neighbors and be around other people and having that social aspect. And I think what's been challenging, especially with the housing movements that you've seen over the past couple of years especially, is people can't afford it. I mean, right now, as it stands, I could not afford to go out and buy my house. Like, I could not afford to live where I live right now. And that's a problem because, I feel like when you're talking about young families, I have school-age kids, we're kind of like a key demographic and we've been seeing this in Vermont and New Hampshire, right? This 10-plus year, and more than that, but move towards the south, so from northern and central Vermont, New Hampshire to like southern New Hampshire, southern Vermont. And I think some of that is reflected in the cost. And the problem is too, is as I see it, is there's these ripple effects, right? You're not keeping people within the community, they're leaving, you can't necessarily have housing mobility to allow people to find the housing that meets their current needs. They kind of get stuck with the choices that they've made. And sometimes people are perfectly happy and great, that's awesome, but sometimes people want to make those changes and they just can't. And I think that ripples out and is just part of what's driving up some of this cost, this residual cost. And so I think, we really need to start, not just providing like things to do. I mean, that's part of why we moved up here. It's a great environment, and but it's also like people got to be able to afford to buy in, and I don't think you really can see that right now.
Just to build off of both of those a little bit, I think when you hear the phrase, like you couldn't afford to buy the house that you live in, that disparity, or whatever the right terminology is for, if you pay $1,600 a month in rent, but you're not going to qualify for a mortgage that might be $1,200 a month or something, like there's some breakdown there that I think it's interesting to explore as a solution in terms of lenders and incentives of creating generational wealth by having young families with the ability to be able to not only rent, but to purchase their home that then builds wealth that they gain and can hand down to their generations. And in still we don't have the stock to do that. So even if we had the housing stock and that were an option, we can get to that, but we haven't gotten to that yet. And one thing I have just sort of informally pitched a little bit over the last couple of years our town had rescinded our impact fees for developers about 2016 or 2017. I don't know if Lebanon has such things, but I've been kind of throwing out the idea of incentivizing impact fees so that you start really high for any development that's going to take place, and that as it meets certain criteria for sustainability, affordability, the kind of green space amenities that communities want, that families want, then the impact fees dissolve and they chip away. So it's not necessarily discouraging development, it's encouraging the types of development that I think a lot of our planning departments and our town plans are interested in. And then lastly on that piece, I will say that attracting young families, I think it's important to recognize, I think we will all experience climate migration, which is established, and we must think about that on a multicultural level so that it's not just attracting young families, but attracting young families of diverse culture, and what does our community and the housing elements of our community offer to them too.
One thought, obviously, is that people go through stages, and pre-family, young adults, it seems like there's to the extent the market's addressing the issue, a lot of studio and one-bedroom apartments are getting developed. But I also see young families who have increasing number of children still trying to live in two-bedroom units because that's part of what's available in the market. So I think people go through stages and they want different choices. And I'm lucky I've been in the same house for 44 years now. And it started just with 3 people more or less right out of college renting an apartment. And then for a decade, it was a cooperative household of single adults. And then some of us became a family with foster children, and we wanted less density and less social life with young adults, but we wanted a yard and ability to have, those kinds of amenities. So when we think about the more dense development that's going on, we have to start thinking about the outdoor space and recreational opportunities that's going to support growing families. And just to kind of get to the second part of the question, over time, we've sort of shrunk to we're just 2 people in what was, when we moved into it, 2 apartments that, held 5 or 6 people. And we're thinking about wanting to downsize, so we're very much thinking about the ADU idea of building a unit that eventually one or both of us could move into, and wanting to somehow convey the house to the right new young family to sort of take over. Because the funny thing is I couldn't afford to buy the house that we're in now based on sort of even fairly recent income, but fortunately we just paid off the mortgage. So I'm thinking, what can we do to be our own little part of the solution to the problem, and continue to toy with the ADU idea, but enabling other people to do that, and enabling other people who have extra space in their home to somehow make that available. Because we do have friends who have rented parts of their homes or rooms, and we've done that ourselves in the past, and that providing the structure to support that in a safe way could be something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Just listening to kind of the thread or multiple threads that are coming forward, and something that's coming up for me is, and what I'm hearing, which maybe isn't necessarily exclusive to young families, but is choice, is the ability to choose to have that mobility, to be able to live in the community that you feel really connected to and can take roots in. And then, when you get to the place where you're downsizing, you have that choice too. That doesn't necessarily require you to move super far away. So the other thing to thread in, I think, too, is workforce housing and how that plays into it as well. So families, in young families, being able to live near to where they work, which helps, if they're cut down, transportation times and the labor involved of, taking kids to and from school and things like that. So being able to actually be rooted in where you're working and be able to afford that, I think, is key for young families.
Thank you. Is there, do either of you have a question for this subgroup? A question that comes to mind that prompts some of your thinking or something that you heard? Yeah.
Well, I guess I'd be curious to hear if any of you have thoughts or opinions on things like impact fees and also rental registry, which the Vermont governor vetoed recently. It was fully supported through the rest of the legislature. And I think, I don't know that I could aptly do it justice, or one of our state reps is here and probably could, but in addition to things like having designated officers that were in charge of inspecting for safety things and stuff, I think it's the kind of thing that would also potentially create a transparency on what people are charging for rent and what is being, so for example, I mean, there's a current property management company that has properties both in Lebanon and in Hartford, as well as other places, that there have been tenants that bring their lease to the Attorney General saying, is this legal, that they can charge fees for all these? So basically more transparency in what the property management and the rental property owners are doing and offering for their tenants. And so I guess I'm curious, is that anything that has come up in your discussions, or do you have opinions?
I don't think we've necessarily discussed that, at least since I've been on council specifically. I think more on the impact fees side, we've had discussions around some of the planning and development fees, but I think really where we've tended to have more discussions are around the 79E program in New Hampshire, where we can provide essentially tax abatement if they meet certain criteria, which is in line with kind of what you're saying, where, if it provides, workforce housing, if it, is revitalizing I can't remember all the rules, but there's these criteria that you can meet that then we would, if it meets that criteria, then we can vote to provide tax abatement on that as a way to incentivize the kind of development that we're looking to see.
Thank you.
A question I have is really what are some of the preferences of younger people these days? I'm not really sure, looking, my own reference back 40 years doesn't necessarily apply. And the interesting thing, just from when I was serving in the Senate and had a real diversity of towns in that area, just experiencing sort of a different culture in the central communities like Lebanon and Hartford, where people tend to want to be in neighborhoods and in community more, compared to some of the smaller rural towns where people wanted a lot of space and were not so concerned about having there's definitely a community life in the smaller towns that a lot of people like, but also there's just sort of a little bit of a different culture. And for a while, there was a trend that people moving to the area wanted the more rural, open countryside and the convenience of coming in and working in town. But my sense is that's become much less affordable, and it's also has its drawbacks if people don't want to spend time commuting and want more of the things that a community like Hartford or Lebanon offer. And I just don't have a sense of that because we do see, a lot of the housing construction is in our core communities and much less in the rural communities, but I don't know how much of that is people's preference and how much of that is sort of the zoning and cost structure.
feel like people are looking at me as the young. I'm happy to speak from my experience, so I can't certainly not speak for every young person, but actually for me, I think it relates to, like, I think housing and transportation feel really key to me because I've lived only in cities before coming to this area. I lived in Austin, Texas. I lived in New York City. And so the biggest shift for me was, I can't just hop on the subway and go to, and explore a new place or, find the thing that might not be where I am right now, but I can go find it somewhere else. So to be able to also kind of connect both the kind of immediate community and have, amazing different activities and arts and culture, and job opportunities, to have access to that, but then also to be able to, if it's not there, go find it elsewhere. And that's been the biggest challenge, I think, for me is, okay, well, I have to make sure I have a car, and I'm grateful that I have one, but, for young folks who maybe aren't in that position, how are they actually being able to kind of get out and explore, everything that our broader community really has to offer?
Yeah, because just someone else said this, but I think it's worth noting, right? It's not just the cost of housing; it's the cost of living here, and the cost of Vermont and New Hampshire. The cost of living here is so dramatically higher than in other parts of the country because you need a car, because you need the gas to get there, right? We joke about it's a short drive; it's only 30 minutes, right? And people were. Look at me from, I grew up in New Jersey, 30 minutes was like halfway across the state. So I think being able to recognize that it's this multifaceted issue that really all ties in together.
Mm-hmm. So far you've talked about people before they have a families, a little bit about downsizing, and then older adults in the area. Connect that to this for families and young people. What are some of the thoughts that come up when you think about that sort of combination?
I think that's where there's so many layers, obviously, but meeting the basic needs, for people to be able to remain in their homes. There was a mutual aid group during the peak of the pandemic where people were available to volunteer, and so there was, so-and-so needed a prescription picked up, so-and-so was delivering groceries, someone took this person to the Haven to pick up their monthly food pickup, things like that, and having that network created genuine relationships for some older folks who were in their homes but didn't have caretakers or a family that was there to support them. It basically really strengthened the fabric of community and allowed them to maintain, so I think that doesn't solve the housing issue, but I think so that maybe in this context of discussion, it's more about how then, in order to stay in homes, people who don't have family there to support, to do the home sharing and or ADUs and that kind of thing. I think that is the kind of thing that has been discussion. And it seems like it's more of that being more of an individual decision, right? Where it's not say if interest rates go down again to almost 0% and a municipality decides to borrow $5 million and build, subsidized housing. That's one thing, could be for elderly, but I think the decision for older, the elders in our community is more about whether they can maintain their existing housing and support that and be supported in that, and or, what facilities are worthy and able to assist. So, of course, multi-generational is ideal, but go ahead.
Yeah,
So a couple more minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to piggyback on a couple ideas that you folks have talked about, and that is, for myself, my wife and I have tried to figure out how, as we age, to get down on one level, and that meant mortgaging the house, and that meant making it less affordable than it ever used to be. And I wonder if there would be a way to create programs that would help folks who are trying to downsize figure out how they can downsize in their house, but then make the rest of the space available for additional housing. Not necessarily a separate building even, but within that space. And I wonder that that kind of education doesn't happen. You're sort of facing this problem. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And who's going to help us? And I think the kind of idea that Cliff was doing makes perfect sense to me. So now the next step has to be, where's the program to support that? Where's the information to help people get to that place? Because we have a lot of existing older stock housing that could very easily be turned into, whether it's a duplex or whether it's, 2 apartments or whatever, however it could be done. But I think there's a need. If we could find that kind of a program get built, then that would help solve some of our problems.
Okay, any burning thought?
I would just add that let's keep in touch, because I don't want to speak for our amazing planning department in Hartford, but there is some really great work happening around accessory dwelling units and specific programs around that to support that and to get the information out there so folks know what the option is. So I would just say let's keep talking.
All right, so before y'all move, I'm just curious if, we can't do a full go-around, but I'm just wondering if 1 or 2 people just, if something stood out to you in this conversation that you want to comment on. Lanny?
I heard quite a bit. One of the things that maybe I did not hear that I think is actually missing in this aspect is that throughout one's life cycle, your needs within your community change so much. Affordable daycare is something that's lacking in the Upper Valley on both sides of the river. That's important for young couples. And then the next stage of life is recreational activities. And I'm not trying to stereotype any particular age group or anything like this, but you need affordable daycare. You need recreational activities. Both sides of the river, we've got pretty good recreational activities. Arts and cultural aspects for when you get older and your kids are at high schools, but then you need your good school systems. And then when you're in your longer stages of life, like right now, the ability to care for elderly parents, as far as like nursing homes or facilities to help out in-house care. There's not a lot of availability for in-house care for companies that do that kind of thing. And so throughout one's life cycle, there's all these needs, and they may be there for everyone throughout your entire life cycle. But like I say, the daycare is a huge one. We always hear about daycare. And I'm facing right now, the biggest hurdle I'm facing is affordability of having personal care services come in and housekeeping services come in to help out. So that's another one. So great it is, but a couple of others to add. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. One other, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and Kim brought this up, and I'm only going to say this is from my own experience. I have a 29-year-old daughter. I adopted her from China, but she grew up in the Upper Valley. But for her, and right now she's in Germany, the lack of diversity in the communities is a huge issue. I mean, she had some diversity in her high school. There were a group of 6 young women who hung around together. 2 of them were from, Mandy was from China and Harini was from India. But when I look back on those kids, those girls who are now young women, all of them have left the Upper Valley. And it's not because they're just city folk, but their world is very different, and I know it's kind of a conundrum. How do we bring diversity to the community? And it's tough because we don't have housing and we don't have other opportunities. But my daughter says, I'm going to a city where there's a lot more diversity. She was even looking at it when she went to UVM. And she said, Mom, they only have between 11 and 15% diversity back then. So, yeah, we get a little bit, but it's, we're not a big city. So, and it's harder to attract people, like we've been saying all along. But I just wanted to say, since we weren't talking about young people, that is something that I know is a big issue among a lot of young people.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Michael.
Maybe one more.
So one more, and then we'll do a
Break.
brief break.
Great. I just wanted to comment, when Kim mentioned the impact fees and sort of the idea of, encouraging certain types of development or putting a cost on other types of development, it made me start thinking again about sort of the overall community, right? Like, what if you had one town with impact fees and what if you had another without, right? Like, the idea is some sort of coordination, which is tough because our towns are part of two different states. I mean, it took an act of Congress to create the Norwich-Hanover School District, right? So there may be some sort of structural obstacles. And so I think it's good we're talking about these things, but I think, any sort of effort like that, there's going to have to be some sort of cooperation or communication or just an identification of what we can or can't do. I mean, we have two very different states that I think prioritize things in different ways. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Great. So let's take about a 5-minute break, which we know will be about 8 minutes, but if it could not be 12 minutes, that would be great, okay? So 5-minute break.
Comment about planting trees.
Mine, I didn't want to make much noise.
No, we need you back. Sorry, that's the problem. Yeah, all right, but we can get you jumping in. So the topic for this one is really that, what is called the missing middle, alternatives to single-family detached homes, and alternatives to huge apartment complexes. So kind of what is some of the things that you've seen, some of the things that you would hope to see, thoughts about that that's very grounded in where you are, in your towns, the missing middle. Yeah.
So, this one? Is it on?
He will catch you if it's, yep, there you go.
There? Okay. So, as my council knows, the missing. I think that I first encountered this sort of missing middle issue when I was doing housing for Dartmouth and traveled the country and looked at other communities, Seattle, Washington area, the Boulder, Colorado area, and saw how much further out ahead they were than us in creating neighborhood-based infill projects with small, intelligently designed houses on small lots or zero lots. So these were all freestanding single-family homes, so you felt like you had a home and you had some curtilage around that home, but then you had common open space with other homes. And none of these were large. They were an acre or 2 acres. They were classic infill projects. We've never really done that in this part of the country, and I think that that is a way to get these entry-level homes and also homes for older people like myself, and I just built a small home like that, that just aren't present in the market, but there's a huge demand for them. Unfortunately, they are not very profitable for developers, right? So for sale homes, the way developers make money is to have, big lots and big houses, 3,000 square feet, whatever. That's how they make their money back. It's difficult. You certainly won't find national developers to do these small infill missing middle projects. So you need a group of dedicated local developers who are willing to partner with the communities and help to do these very intelligent, smaller infill projects that I think will both enhance the communities and could provide incredible opportunities that just don't exist today.
It sounds fun too, actually.
It is. It's my retirement job.
Yeah, other folks.
I think that's interesting. The missing middle was a term I wasn't really familiar with before actually coming here tonight. So it's nice to get that context, and I do see why that would be a very popular, option for people. It seems like an accessory dwelling unit, that's usually just maybe a homeowner who's got an extra room. You've got the big apartment buildings, which are for the major developers. And so that was sort of my question, who is it that wants to,
They're playing basketball upstairs.
Oh, okay.
They're not going to fall in.
So that was my question, is like, what is the incentive to build these? And if it's not there, just like in the marketplace, what kind of steps would be helpful to sort of encourage that type of building? Because it seems like something we'd want, something compact, but that idea of having your own place, particularly talking about families, and talking about seeing families still living in, a single, just like a studio apartment, and I don't know if that's ideal, so.
So one way of incentivizing, Mike, that Lebanon's looking at right now is something called pattern zoning. And we're working with a firm out in the Midwest, potentially on a proposal to provide us with a pattern zoning program. And what pattern zoning does is it essentially pre-approves a type of development. You still have to go through the planning board process, but it's an abbreviated process because a lot of things are fixed if you agree to do them. Mm-hmm. And then you literally can be provided with a set of home designs. So it takes a lot of the risk out for the developer and a lot of the upfront costs, so they can see an end point, mm-hmm. and it makes it easier for them to calculate what their profit opportunity is going to be. And I think we'll likely bring more local, smaller developers into that market. We're not there yet, but it's something we're going to be working actively on the next year. Great.
Yeah. Other folks?
I just want to ask on that, is that pattern programming something that, like individual, so if you're not a developer, but you're an individual with property and you're going to hire a contractor, you could do that?
You could absolutely do it, yeah.
Great.
Yes.
You want to jump in?
To me, you look back and you can think about your childhood and you think what it was like to be in the neighborhood, that you could run around, be at the other kids' houses, play there, have space outside so that you could go out and play in the woods, build your little tree house, do whatever. But that community then pulled together. And you knew that neighborhood, you knew whose mother was going to send you home because it was dinner time. And building a neighborhood, I think, is something that takes from individuals to being part of a cultural awareness of, hey, there's a whole bunch of kids and there's 10 of them out there and we're all raising them. And I don't think that's a bad thing to have. I had my youngest son come back one day and he said, Dad, there's a woman said she was going to call you because I was walking through the cemetery. He said, I wasn't doing anything. I was just coming home the shortest way. And, you know, you had the feeling that the community was taking care of your kid. And I think that happens when you build enough houses close enough together in an area, or you fill in enough so that you can have more family involvement there. And that is a really important thing. And I think that we have a variety of other forces that were not there back in the 50s, but certainly High Street in Lebanon is moved up about 15 steps on the ladder compared to what it was back then. It doesn't have the community aspect, I think, as much as what it did back then, but the environment is so much nicer. But I think there are ways of taking a potentially substandard environment and re-envisioning it. And if we can encourage people to go ahead and upgrade an area so that you can build a community feeling that people want to move into there and want to be there, that it's a challenge that to upgrade the community, make everybody better. And how you do that is a pig in the poke.
Yeah. Well, you're naming a lot of things that are, you know, we're talking about housing and you're talking about homes and families and neighbors. And it's connected, right?
I think that this arc we're on from being, you know, very community interdependent, and then we've had this long history of you know, nuclear family isolation, independent, and that we are, I think, aiming back toward a more interdependent. And I feel like you know, even the infill, you know, as Karen mentioned about the, you know, the different elements of Lebanon being a city but feeling like a small town. And in Hartford, we have our 5 villages, and some are very, you know, wilder neighborhood, like community and kids on bikes, and West Hartford more rural and even agricultural. And then White River Junction being very, you know, our urban center, our micro-urban center. But in the tremendous development that has happened, that Rocket referenced, like in the last 20 years, there's certainly elements of gentrification, but it's all almost exclusively happened in vacant spaces. So it's been, you know, either a vacant lot or vacant buildings that have been revitalized and infilled with residential and commercial activity. That I think that sort of vertical development in areas that it can be, and then in you know, we do have this great blessing of having our town and city have great rural elements to it, that there can be, we can still have that, I think, and also do a lot of the infill to actually serve the need.
Chris, you got a thought?
Kim kind of really jumped right where I was going to go next, was kind of that, you know, commercial, residential type of a building where, you know, your commercial businesses, first floor, second, third, and floor, can be your housing. My stepdaughter lives outside Washington, D.C., and the apartment building that she's in, I guess maybe not this time, the apartment building before, sorry, pre-COVID, had a grocery store underneath it, a large grocery store, as well as there was a gym and several other businesses. So, you know, that idea of something like on a main street, say in West Lebanon, if you redeveloped it in a format of commercial and then housing above, Because we're all trying to talk about and get to that workable, livable spaces for housing, so I don't know.
Just building on something that Kim was talking about, I think that one of the discussions we have to have, and particularly Hartford and Lebanon, because we are the sort of urban center, is what do we want to be? And one of the things we're looking at in Lebanon is what is our ideal proportion of developed versus undeveloped land? I mean, where do you, we know we can be beyond where we are now and still have a very high quality of life, but we want to try to establish a guideline for where we stop. And part of that is urban services area. Both our communities know how incredibly expensive it is to maintain water and sewer utilities, and even more expensive to expand them. So we're all dealing with that sort of limited area if we want to stay within our current urban services boundary of how do we most efficiently utilize that area. And I would argue that that infill is an incredibly important part of that. And how do we do that infill in such a way that it does not diminish the quality of life in the existing neighborhoods? And part of that is intelligent design. And I will tell you that the market doesn't tend towards intelligent design. The market tends toward what has the highest profit margin. And that's an area where communities can sort of intervene and have a positive role. And then how do you communicate out to those neighborhoods that what could happen, yes, is a change, but it's not a threat either to the value of your property or to the quality of your life. And those are the big challenges that I think we see moving forward with our new zoning program and new pattern zoning and whatever, is it has to be a community-wide effort, and we really need very wide buy-in. You can't shove this down people's throats.
So one of my questions is, what's intelligent design as you are using the term? And then I'm wondering if, as we're talking about this missing middle, most of what we've talked about is infill, and is there something else that comes to mind?
I'll address the first part. I think intelligent design is aesthetically attractive, energy conscious use of space. And you know, if you go to the magazines and you look at architectural designs in Texas or the South or someplace, you know, it's now you have to have 3,000 square feet, and it has to have a 3-story foyer, and it has to have all these things that drive up the cost of the house, but don't really give you a more functional house. So when a lot of us were children, you know, we grew up in houses that were 1,000, 1,200 square feet, and we had 2 or 3 siblings, and it was fine because that's what our parents grew up with. And as we got into the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, somehow that paradigm changed. And I need a mini mansion, I need a McMansion, right? And we need to back off from that. And that's not something the market based economy is necessarily going to do. There are architects out there who do wonderful design work. And once people walk into one of those homes, they tend to go, oh, I don't need 3,000 square feet. I can get by in 1,500 square feet. So just a really quick example, when my wife and I were looking to downsize into a single story, we wanted to stay in Lebanon. We looked, we couldn't find anything that suited us. I ended up designing an 1,100 square foot house. We had it modularized. We found a little lot, and boom, and it's perfect. And people walk into it and go, how can this be 1,100 square feet? It feels a lot bigger. Well, it's how you design it.
All right, thank you. Anything else other than infill?
Well, I was just thinking about this a little more just because this idea is really kind of exciting. You know, it's not something that I'd really thought about before, but just thinking about the idea of building in a way, you know, that not only helps create these kind of neighborhoods that you spoke about. I mean, otherwise you're out, you know, you put up a house and everyone's like an island, you know, there's no sense of community. So taking that into consideration, I think, is really important, you know, especially in this day and age, sort of fostering those connections. And then also, it seems like one of those things that could be done in an environmentally friendly way. If you've got everything sort of placed together, you know, when it comes to water or electrical panels or how they're doing things like that. So it seems like there's a lot there, you know, and I just think it's very exciting. I think that there is that question, you know, at some point, like, where does this stop? Like, how far does it branch out until you're running out of services or you're running out of, you know, local transportation? But it certainly seems like, you know, that really is sort of like an ideal fit between between, just the ADUs or the studio apartments, because, you can build 1,000 studio apartments and you probably get like 1,000 single people or maybe couples, but in order to make a place family friendly, it's going to take more than that, So, and certainly, there are major employers in the region. They're bringing in people from all over the country, a lot of the times new families, things like that. So, I think it's important. In some sense, I think, it's not just housing for the sake of housing necessarily. It's like we have to build housing. How do we do it in the best, most sustainable way possible? And what does that look like? And it's obviously probably going to be some mixture of all these different approaches. So I appreciate Tim telling us about this, frankly.
I think we need to think about inclusive. How do we bring that neighborhood around to involve more kids, more adults? We need to reach out and think as we design and as we look at our zoning and say, is this going to allow people to have more people in their sphere of influence? Are they going to see more people? Are they going to be out walking? Are they going to find a place where it feels comfortable for them to walk?
Yeah, you're naming the things that make somebody want to stay. Walkability, meeting your neighbors, interacting with other kids.
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely. I think one block that we tend to hit sometimes is the whole, this may not be a popular thing to say, but hearing the phrase character of the neighborhood drives me a little bananas, because this is, I think, where we need to bridge with our younger families and elders in the community and those in between is a mix of old and new. And we need to be able to embrace that yes, we all, I have those very cherished memories of my neighborhood and, riding bikes and going in the woods with my friends as well and getting sent home by someone else's mom. And I value that tremendously. And I think that can be done. There can also be sense of community in larger mixed income developments that do have green space. And, I think that it doesn't mean that because there hasn't been a 5-story building or a 7-story building in some areas doesn't mean it can't be done and that it shouldn't be done. I think there are ways to really have a sense of community that doesn't look like the ones that we really appreciated and enjoyed.
Another burning thought, a question you might have for each other? We only have a few more minutes on this.
I will just say, when I grew up, it was in what once was the middle of nowhere, Norwich. So when I grew up, I was like, I would never want to live anywhere in town. And the first time I ever got a pizza delivered to me as an adult was like one of the greatest moments of my life. So living in a neighborhood, it's nice. It has a lot of advantages. There are certainly people who love to go out and live as far out, and there's a lot of that in the Upper Valley as well. So.
And I'd like to add one more thing. Like, Mike mentioned the big employers in the Upper Valley, and which Lebanon has a lot, but also Hanover certainly. And, this dialogue is great. Be interesting to get Hanover and Norwich at the table as well. One thought, there was a time a few years ago, I don't know that they're even still interested, but the Norwich School District was interested in tapping into Hartford's wastewater plant, and it was sort of it stalled out, I think. But a thought having more recently is, well, what if we did upgrade and have Norwich consider tapping into Hartford's wastewater? And in part of that arrangement, they agreed to build, 150 mixed income units on Route 5 near King Arthur Flower or something like that. And that there are, I know speaking with Advanced Transit, they're just gotten funding to do a feasibility study for microtransit. And talking with them, like the kind of volume of routes they're doing for Dartmouth Health now, and the college is huge. It's exponential compared to what they're doing in the downtowns in Lebanon and Hartford, because Dartmouth is subsidizing it. So are there other ways that, like, the municipalities can subsidize more frequent public transportation microtransit program, those kind of things. I mean, I hope some of that will be state funded as well with all the transportation initiatives, but those are the kind of things that I think we can also look at that I think we do need to ask Norwich and Hanover to sit at the table and talk with us about helping with our supportive services for our struggling community members and the unhoused community.
Yeah, thank you.
Hallelujah.
Transparent facilitator moment. A few pop-ups or go right to affordable?
A few pop-ups.
Or unhoused, okay. One or two. I'm going to look at Rocket because he had his hand up before we left before.
Oh, that was actually for Mike.
Okay.
I got something.
And then, okay, so anything that you heard here, so Rocket and...
Yeah, I have something.
And then Lanny, okay.
Yeah, is it Tim? I wanted to sort of respond to some of your comments, which I thought were just right on the dot. I think infilling and brownfield redevelopment and developing in density seems to be a really sensible and economically intelligent way for us to do this. But I did want to comment on what you were saying about developers, where intelligent design is not the reflex, but profitable design. I've spoken with and am friendly with a handful of the developers and investors down in downtown White River. And what I think, something that strikes me is that in talking to one of them who owns a bunch of units, or his company does, they have intentionally kept some of their units maybe more affordable than the market would otherwise dictate. Part of that is preserving potentially some of this aspect of the character of the neighborhood, or whatever you would call that, keeping an economic diversity there. And the same person sold 2 of his buildings to local owners. And the reason why, I asked why, he said, well, because so that way they maintain locally owned and operated. The other person that I have in mind has had multiple outside investors come and make bids, unsolicited bids on his portfolio, and has declined all of them. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, because I didn't like them. Right. And I think, so those 2 individuals and their businesses, to me, strike me as quite interesting, because I think that there are a lot of people who are deeply invested in the Upper Valley on an emotional level, and that are making decisions that might on surface seem economic, but more deep than that, there's a great personal and emotional investment as well. And when I think about these challenges from the perspective of governance, we are hamstrung because we are, as Mike pointed out, all siloed out in our own jurisdictions across the river. But then also with things like funding. I mean, when you talk about the infrastructure, the road mileage, I mean, that's insane, and we are very much dependent on factors that are largely outside of our control. But what I think is well within our control is our ability as local governments to provide at least at the minimum, emotional encouragement, if not an outright acknowledgement of some of the people who have taken on huge risks and large investments, and sort of like figuring out how do we play to not just the economic side of it, where we may have less control, but also to some of these more emotional and local sides of it. And that reminds me of, I think, your statement of trying to figure out how you might pass on your home to the next generation of people. So I don't know if that's like a conference or symposium of something that we do to invite all the people of the Upper Valley who are landowners to get together and start thinking about this in the way that wealthy families and family foundations do the same thing, but for maybe investments or an intergenerational wealth transfer.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Lanny, and then we'll bump it to Rob.
Things that both Tim and Rocket and touched on, but also Kim had spoke about the term character of communities. And one of the things I think is a struggle, particularly within Hartford, I hear a lot of older residents in Hartford speak about how Hartford has lost its small town charm. And that's how we have not maintained that charm that was the downtown area. And Hartford was built downtown Hartford, White River Junction Business District was built around the railroads. And the railroads have basically, we still have Amtrak, we still have some freight coming through, but the hub that was a railroad in the Upper Valley was White River Junction, and that's long gone. And so, but still maintaining that small town charm that people love to have the ability to see within small-town communities while still having that infill that we have. The reuse of buildings is a great use for that. Newer structures that come into the downtown area, everybody says, oh, that's an eyesore. That doesn't look anywhere like it belongs at all. And that's the thing that is difficult for us, I think, especially in Hartford, because we have that charm. And I'm not trying to pick on Lebanon, but Lebanon and has West Lebanon. And you have two areas of growth. And in Hartford, it seems like the biggest growth we have is in the White River Downtown Business District. Yeah. And the other thing that we all know in Hartford that we are fighting tremendously is parking downtown. That's a big battle for us that we're having to contend with. And I don't know whether you're fighting that on the side of the river or not, but with the growth comes that need for either parking or for better public transportation. And we don't have either in Hartford right now.
Right, thank you. I don't know if you want to tee up the question before people move?
Yeah, I think I would like to do that. So thank you all. And this is exactly the kind of conversation that I know that Michelle and I were hoping, and I know that Sean and Tracy were hoping, and John and Ellen. This is the kind of exploration of ideas that is exactly the source of regional solutions. And I love to hear the invitation that we can take you up on of getting other towns involved in this conversation, because if we expand infill and transportation to other towns as well, that then there become many more opportunities. The question that we would like to frame up, and then we'll have sort of closing statements, is basically, what have you heard here this evening? And one of the questions that we have not spent a lot of time on is the issue of homelessness and unhoused. And are there ways that, do we hear anything that we want to pursue here? Do we hear anything that might connect with issues of homelessness and the unhoused as well? And where would you like to go from here? So let's take a minute. I'll get out of the way and you guys can find your way back with your microphones to your seats. And just because I picked on Cliff earlier, maybe, Lanny, would you mind kicking us off from that end of the table, and we'll work our way this way?
I was really hoping to piggyback on somebody else. On this one. So,
well, if you'd like to, Lanny, you could pause and we'll come back to you.
Well, I guess it's hard for me to, I hate to start out first. So what we've heard tonight is there is a need. There's definitely a need. There is no one answer that solves all the problem. And the spectrum of people that we have to provide housing for goes all the way from the lower income levels to the six-figure salary levels. And it's distressing both our communities, as well as the other communities that surround us. And it's not just going to be Hanover and Norwich that need to be brought into this conversation. It's also Springfield, Windsor, Heartland, communities, Thetford, the broader Upper Valley that needs to be brought into the conversation. It's just a four-core town aspect. So as far as homelessness in that house community, it's a problem. No one can deny that. I personally feel we need to devote resources towards the cause of homelessness. That's the biggest thing that I think will help to solve some of the problem. I'm a veteran, I'm a 20-year veteran, and proud to serve. And there's no such thing in my opinion as we don't need any homeless vets. And we're working hard on homelessness in Hartford. There's no good answer for homelessness. But if we could provide more services, more job skills-based training, more mental health resources, more drug and alcohol training or reforming for these people. That's the key, I think, is what we need. And yeah, we should have a place to be able to get some people off the street. And I'm at a loss to nowhere. I don't want to throw the blame on Lebanon. I don't want to throw the blame on Hartford. But I don't know. I mean, I'm going to be the first to say I have no idea where. We have a lot of services through the Haven. So beyond that, I don't know.
So the thing that I took away from this mostly is the idea that infill is really important, and that kind of smart development where if you look at it from the point of view of the expense, one of the things we haven't talked about is how development incurs an expense for the community. So existing taxpayers end up having to pay more money to support the services that may come from all these new buildings. And one way you avoid that is to build smart within your infrastructure. And that's why this idea of infill is really, really vital to existing taxpayers, and I think that message gets lost. And when people talk about being upset about all the stuff that's coming into downtown or whatever, if you explain to them that maybe this is going to save your tax dollars, it would be helpful. As far as the homelessness, I'm glad we Mr. Schultz brought that up, because it's an important issue that is on the back burner many times, and it's hard to find the solutions. But there is a model, in my opinion, and now I'm going to do a little plug for the city of Lebanon. And the model is, there was this really decrepit, rundown apartment building on Parkhurst Street. And that building was rehabilitated through a partnership to provide what I'll call temporary or transitional housing for people who are challenged to have a place to live. And that happened because Twin Pines Housing Authority did the real estate piece, and the Haven did the mental health piece that has to go along with that in order to help these people who are challenged in so many different ways to find solutions rather than just more roadblocks. And I think in the end, we're going to have to bite the bullet regionally and figure out that these types of partnerships are what have to happen in order to solve more of our homeless problem.
Something I'm left with is something that came up, I think, in the second Fishbowl, which was what prompts people to stay in a community? And how can we think about how we're approaching housing in a multifaceted, intersectional way to actually answer and support the answer to that question. So that's a big kind of existential wonder that I'm left with, but just how can we approach this in a way how can we design and collaborate in such a way where our approaches to housing are helping folks stay and bringing people here at the same time. I feel like it's a whole other can of worms that I want to get into in terms of talking about homelessness and supporting folks who are unhoused. But in addition to what's already been shared about approaching this in terms of partnership and wraparound services, also, thinking about things from a housing first and transitional housing perspective. So being able to, have things like low barrier shelters, things that help folks if, folks are unhoused and that's point A and point C is being housed, what's in the middle of that, and supporting more transitional housing approaches as folks are, and with those wraparound services as folks are dealing with, lots of complex intersecting issues to really, as Landy mentioned, kind of get to the root of those issues too.
Homelessness and the housing insecure, that's not something that we're going to talk and figure out in the next 5 minutes, is it? I look at it from a standpoint of compassion. You lose compassion, you lose your community. And homeless within our community are in our community. That's kind of but we all sit here as our select board members, city councilors, and we set our respective budgets, and it's the taxes, and that's what we're responsible to all our citizens. But if we can also be enthusiastic about our compassion for those that need assistance and encourage our community to join us in that enthusiasm for being compassionate, I think we can get a start. It's not going to solve it, but just be compassionate to those that are in need.
Agreed, and I think I've hogged the microphone enough, and I think I'll just kind of echo that. It's that meeting basic needs is going to help people be able to get to a place where they can live affordably and healthy lives. And I also am going to follow up with you, Doug, about this abatement versus impact fees thing, so I'll be in touch.
So I think, my takeaway is more of we tend to talk in absolutes. We do it, we want to solve the problem. We want to fix it. And one of the most important things I actually learned in my career in healthcare was from a physician where they were talking about kind of a similar idea. How do we solve this diagnosis? And he said, you're never going to solve it. But someone who may be, at a 10, if they can get to a 6 and stay there, man, you've changed their life. And I think that's the caution I would say is you don't have to necessarily solve it to make progress, and being able to move forward and being able to make progress and getting people from, maybe it doesn't solve all of the issues, but if it's making things better, that's important. And I think it's important when you take on these kind of existential projects to keep that in mind so that you don't get bogged down in the morass of, oh my gosh, we're never going to solve this, right? No, we might not, but we can make it a whole lot better.
I don't know how I follow that up, but so that's okay. So, my takeaway is that, look, folks, this is not going to get any easier. It's going to get harder. Mm-hmm. We know that the environmental problems are not going to get any easier. We know that the energy problems are not going to get any easier. We know that the societal problems are not going to get any easier, and we can't solve it for our states, much less our country. So I think we have to think of ourselves as a region, and one of my goals is to try to regionalize this thing as much as we can. We're going to be in different states. We have different funding sources. We have different communities, but we do have some commonality, and that's that we're all here for a reason. You're all on these boards for a reason, and I think it's because you care about this area, and there's something special about this place, however big this place is. And we're going to have to work together, even sometimes when we don't want to both hang on to what we have and to create a community that's resilient and diverse and healthy going into the future. And I know that's a big job, but we got to start somewhere.
Thanks, and Tim, I thought that was a great statement. That I agree with a lot of what you said. And tonight, what I took away was, I think, basically that I heard a lot of good ideas and thoughtful comments from everyone who was here. And I'm really encouraged by that. And as we mentioned, we have a big lift here, We have a huge need for housing. It's something that we're going to have to address, and I know it can get scary. Things are going to look different in towns, and things are going to change, and that's not always easy, but, it's something we just have to do. I grew up around the Upper Valley, and I always think there's a line that's before the hospital was built and then after, that they're different. That was sort of a dividing line for what these communities are going to look like, and they've grown ever since. And, we're going to get it done, and it's going to be, it's not going to be easy, but I'm really encouraged by everyone who was here and what everyone had to say and some of the great ideas. And this idea of us working together, and this idea of regionality, I think is really important. And it'll help us get to a place that might be a little frightening, in a way that reflects, our values of the Upper Valley, what we want to see in different communities, everything like that. So I really enjoyed being here tonight.
I think we're on a journey, and it's going to be a long one, it has been a long one already. If we look back at what our society was willing to do to help those in need, and I'm thinking about our homeless today, but on the Meriden Road, there was the Poor Farm, and people went and lived there and worked there. And on Tickner Road, there was the Bug House for anybody that was sick, that there was a place to go. But in the turn of the 19th century, they also had families that needed a place to be, and Lebanon built houses, which is called a transient camp by us. And in that camp, you had families that would come to town, get a job in the mill because you had a place to go to work, and move yourself out of that. I had a classmate who was regularly commented to me about how proud his father was that he could have a job and he was going to get him a house in town, but he spent most of his school life living in the transient camp. And he said it was so wonderful when they could move up into town and be there with the rest of the kids. We've gone past that, and when the state dropped the many services which they used to provide, and let that all drop back to the cities or towns, we're now in the position of needing to deal with services that are blatantly, obviously needed, but we haven't had the facility to take care of those. And I think as a community, we need to build the resilience and the willingness to come out and say, how can we make this work better? Because there are more people out there that need help than what many of us would imagine. I had foster children. I also had a boy that I adopted, but I also had 18 other people's kids, teenagers, grow up in my house. And I suggest for each and every one of us to reach out and see who's in the community that you could help, because there are people that need it. And being able to reach out comes away with a wonderful thing. Moser presently lives in Anchorage, Alaska, because he said he couldn't find anybody that looked like him here. And he says, in Alaska, they don't care what I look like. But our community, I think, is becoming more accepting, more willing to reach out. And I think that's a path that we all need to be on. And reach out to others that may be less fortunate, may need to lift up. But if we can come up with ways where we can do more infill, more community building, more neighborhoods, then there's the challenge. And I applaud what you folks have done in Hartford, and I wish I could see one of those little houses that you had up for a while. And I think if there are more creative solutions like that, the people could have a much better handle on survival up here in the Upper Valley. So congratulations on what you were doing there.
Well, I thought this was great, and I am feeling deeply optimistic, but that might be native to my personality. I think, I believe, and I know that we can solve this problem in the way that people put men on the moon, with computers that were less powerful than the computers in each one of our phones. At its core, the problem of homelessness has a very simple solution, which is homes. But when you look at homes and you look at the affordability of housing, there are two simple drivers. One side is supply, and the other side is demand. The demand side, I think, is not a way that any of us wants to solve, which is by reducing demand for housing. I think that's not in any of our list of goals. So then, to solve affordable housing, we need to solve the supply side. And then when you break that down further, I think you can find that there are economic factors at play, there are zoning factors at play, there are cultural factors at play, and there's sort of, as I mentioned earlier, emotional factors at play. But I think it's fully within our ability to break that down in a methodical way and start finding solutions. The problems are getting more complex, certainly, and with climate change, it's going to get trickier still. But we have access to better tools and better communication than anybody who has ever lived in human history. And I think that with focus and with collective faith, it might take a little bit of time, but these are all solvable issues. And if they weren't, then why waste our time, right? So I think at the root of it, I think this is what it is that while we do have immediate challenges in front of us, I think it's important, in my mind, that we solve the problem by pulling at the root and not by attacking at the leaf. And so when we really break that down carefully and think on a systemic level for the Upper Valley, but then also by different dimension, we say, how can we solve this? And I think we totally can. So I appreciate, it was great to hear other perspectives, and I feel like I've learned a lot. And I want to thank the two of you for helping organize this wonderful event. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, first I want to thank everyone for pulling this together and getting everyone to the table. I think it was a very productive evening. I want us to sort of take a step back, and my takeaway from this are things that we have in the Upper Valley that work. Transportation is one thing, but we need to expand that for nights and weekends for people that don't have cars, is one example. So all the What?
Amen.
Yeah. And so these all are interconnected to our housing issues, the transportation of people that don't have vehicles. A group of the population that we haven't really mentioned tonight is people with disabilities, so I want to be sensitive to, as we develop housing and places for these individuals to live, that there are options for them because they are part of our community. I want us to think about the pandemic and how the hotels hosted individuals that were homeless. So let's reach out to Dartmouth and other places and find out the dorm rooms that could potentially be used when the students aren't there. I think we've got some things on the ground. We can take these things at work and transfer them to different situations. I think it's Sweden that uses senior assisted living facilities and pairs with daycare centers. I think that's something that we could explore to help solve our childcare issues in the Upper Valley, is having someone connect those dots so that there is childcare, and it's a great resource for the elderly people that live there. I want to look, another thing that we have that's very successful is the Haven. So I think it's 40 years now they've been in place, and they know what they're doing. They've figured out a lot of things. I think we need to take that model, and not on that immediate site necessarily, but other places in the Upper Valley, and duplicate that. And one other thing I think that's important to look at is exchange students, and not your traditional high school exchange students, but this would bring people, give us many more people of cultural diversity here in the Upper Valley. And I think that if those arrangements could be made with people that were elderly, that they could be screened, and those people could live in their houses, sort of assisting them if they have an interest in medical care, as they either continued here or had jobs here. So that would involve getting longer visas and those kinds of things. But I think we need to look at things in our community, in the larger world, that other cultures do that are successful, and bring them here to the Upper Valley. So I think that's all the little pieces that connect to our housing, and I thank you again for having us this evening.
I also share Rocket's optimistic personality trait, I think, and I'm very encouraged, as Michael was talking about as well, by the discussion that we've had tonight, and I am so appreciative that our communities share really thoughtful, engaged people who are trying to tackle problems that are really bigger than any one of our communities. And I do look forward to hopefully continuing this. What I hope for tonight is that our administrations have heard the discussion, and that they will be able to have some conversations, that our planning and zoning staff might be able to follow up on some of these ideas that we've talked about. So I do hope that these conversations will continue both at the table, that the regional, that more communities will be brought to the table in due time. I also don't necessarily want to rush that, because I think we need to maybe let something gel here, and then invite people to join something. So in due time, I certainly do hope that it will regionalize. I think, so that's my hope for the future. One of the concepts that I've been thinking on tonight is we talked about the different needs of housing at the different cycles of life, that our needs change. And we also heard people talk about their memories of what their housing and what their communities were like when they were younger. And one of the things that really sits with me is how families have changed over time, and how families look very different now. But I really like what Kim was talking about, that we are maybe moving back into or at least a recognition that we are interdependent. And so maybe family just looks a little different than what it used to, or maybe we're just recognizing that families never actually looked a certain way. And so I think that's an important part of the discussion, is that there's not some ideal past that we're trying to get back to, but there is a future, a just, equitable, compassionate future where everyone belongs. And I think everyone has a home. And I think that's the vision that we have. And part of what makes it complex is that we don't know exactly what that looks like. We have to build the model as we go. And so I'm just reflecting, I was reflecting on how families have changed and what the impact of that is on what housing looks like, and how we live in societies that are also somehow, that the economy is an important part of, but that is not necessarily the defining factor. But I think that's really important. And so I'm going to hold on to these concepts as we hopefully continue these conversations and figure out what that future looks like.
Well, it's hard to be on the end, isn't it? But Lanny probably understands that as well. Now you're first. There's not a lot that I can add to this, because again, like everybody has said, this has been a wonderful opportunity to share. And I think it's accomplished a beginning. And we all know that we have to go from here. And we all know it will expand at some point in time. But what I am, and I think this goes to sometimes the heart of the homeless or unhoused issues, is we've been talking a lot here about, ideas, which are great. And we've talked about some of the physical aspects of houses. And I think we all know, based on what Karen just said, that there's also an attitude that has to be fostered among our communities. And that's something that takes a lot of work, and not being afraid and not being passive, and recognizing we have to talk to people, whether on one side of the river or the other. We've got to keep going in that aspect. And I think that shows that we are the region and not just one community. So thank you all. This has been really wonderful for me. I've really enjoyed it, even though it causes lots of, strain on the brain. But anyway, thank you very much.
I think a couple of themes that struck me is the different dimensions of diversity and inclusiveness, which is the need for the diversity of the housing types, the need to think about how we include all parts of our community in thinking about how we provide adequate housing. Even thinking about the unhoused, the transition from emergency housing to supported transitional housing, to sort of what comes next. And that, do people just go back on their own in terms of employment and finding an apartment, or how do we continue to support that? And we have had a good example of a conversion of housing in our downtown neighborhoods for people with disabilities in a supportive environment, but they're also independent living. And how do we sort of expand that model in thinking about the diversity? And I think, Mary, your comment about your adopted child who grew up here but moved away, and the many young people who grow up here and move away. Not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you know, people want to experience life in different ways, but I think keeping in mind that notion, that, you know, what it's always appealed to me about Lebanon and Hartford, I actually lived in Hartford a little bit once, was the socioeconomic diversity of the communities, and increasingly we're becoming more racially and culturally diverse in various ways, and I think that's something that we can build upon, that can, you know, that is part of our strength, really. And the other takeaway is the commitment and thoughtfulness and creativity that comes from just knowing, you know, all of the public commitment of, you know, all of us who are working to better our communities. And I think we'll find that in a lot of our neighboring communities as well. So I think we have a lot to build upon.
Yes, indeed. Well, I want to start off just by saying thank you to all of you for your perspectives and your wisdom and your willingness to participate in this conversation. So thanks to the boards, and thanks to Sean and Tracy for inviting us, and thanks to Michelle and Michaela for coming up from Dover. Appreciate your presence. You know, what we were wanting to set up tonight was a conversation in which we moved beyond 10,000 units. We wanted to have a conversation that wasn't just about 10,000 units. All right? There is still that number. It's still out there. But we wanted to have a conversation that had to do with, well, what do we value in our communities? What do we want to create here? What types of housing? For whom? How can we, what are some ways that we can get at that? I like telling stories, and one story that came out of Leadership Upper Valley a couple years ago was one of the vice presidents at a fantastic local bank had the misfortune of needing to be at Dartmouth Health for about 10 days. But he's a numbers guy. So he thought, this is a great opportunity. I want to think about housing. So he asked every person that came into his room how far they needed to drive to work that day. And he kept track of every person, every LNA, every doctor, every nurse, every hospitalist, every specialist, right? The average that they were driving to work was 45 minutes. And most of those people are working a 12-hour shift. So most of those people that we're depending on for our health that are working a 12-hour shift are driving 45 minutes on each end of that 12-hour shift in order to get to work. And those folks have really good salaries. So that's the kind of thing that we need to figure out. And that's also an example of why we need to be thinking about housing, as you have all pointed out, alongside what's the character of our communities, and alongside how do we do transportation, how do we do energy sustainability. So I think the last point that you all have made, and it seems like a great way for us to go out in terms of Vital Communities being one of the hosts of this event, is that this is a regional issue that needs to involve collaboration, and collaboration across the river and to the north and south, because there is a space and there's commitment, and some of it has to do with services, and some of it has to do with transportation, some of it has to do with infill. How can we get smart together? So it's a great opportunity. Thank you all very much. Thanks for everybody for coming. Let's do it again sometime.
All right.